Discussions in your breakout rooms will not be recorded. Recording is just for us to then post the videos of this afterwards. There will be student committee members within your groups taking notes, and that's just for us to collect any feedback from you in your groups. If there's something that's super pertinent that you want to share out, you're more than welcome to hang out after the meeting and talk to any of us on the committee. With that out of the way, we're just going to recap our Unlearning series in general, as we do at the beginning of each of them. Again, like I mentioned, we've been using this bit.ly/C80 Unlearning as kind of our website for the discussion series. So you can visit that link to see past discussions, recordings, and view the resources we've linked with these presentations. We've kind of jumping the time around throughout the discussion to try and get as many people who can make it. You know, if you're busy in the afternoon, maybe make it some of the evening ones. And so if you missed any of our past discussions, you can always catch the recording part on that website on YouTube. We've talked about anti-racist design, planning, and building, placemaking, gentrification, and the process of queering spaces throughout this series. And we are hoping to continue it throughout the school year. So at the end, there will be a short survey for you to fill out. And if you want to give some feedback to directly to our faces, like I said, you're more than welcome to hang out afterwards and chat with us. Today, we're going to be talking about why Black landscapes matter and hopefully start to introduce some specifics here of the context of San Luis Obispo and some of the events that have been happening around there. And I want to enter this conversation with the work of Walter Hood, a Black landscape architect. And this quote is pulled from one of his interviews with The Dirt, a landscape architecture publication. And the central question in this interview is asking, how do you create diverse landscapes? And so to introduce with this quote, Walter Hood says, "I say difference, not diversity. It's about different ways of interpreting the world. When one puts out multiple narratives, they challenge the singular and its narrative. Oh, the singular and its maintenance." And I bring this quote to talk about, the reason why Walter Hood purposely says difference and not diversity. He continues on to say, "I'm thinking a lot these days about differences and sameness." He cites colonialism as the reason for sameness. It takes things that we see as different and tries to make them into some monolith. And it does that to promote and maintain its own ideas of colonialism. And so he cites double reading of landscape. And so to break this down and why he cites colonialism, we can see this as colonialism, what happens inside the colony, and the colony projects ideas out. So he connects it to America and about Black landscapes in saying, our projection, America as a country, projects out to other groups. America, home of the free and the brave, diversity for all men are created equal. This is sent out to the world. Symbols such as the Statue of Liberty and quotes of "give me your tired and your weak and hungry" are used to build this image. But unfortunately, in trying to create this singular idea about a country or a group of people, the group is recolonized, or things are repainted over to keep that singular idea together. So as the United States, or as a nation, is trying to put out these ideas of diversity for all, or this meta overall totalizing idea, the group is being recolonized or repainted over by the same brush to keep that idea and that narrative intact. And so hopefully what you've been seeing throughout our different discussions is that we've been putting out different tools to try and not generalize and put into these large ideas together. And that's why I mentioned the topics such as anti-racist planning and building, placemaking, and ultimately I hope what you're finding is that it comes down to people and to experiences. And so this brings up the question, what happens when we ignore local histories or the local people living in the area? And for this, I'd like to bring up the case study of the Seneca Village in New York. And so Seneca Village, often cited as being a bottom or lower class space, was a neighborhood with neighborhood things like homes, shops, families, schools, and churches. And while slavery was still an economic engine for the US, Seneca Village was offered one of the country's first free towns, where freed Black Americans and other alienated ethnic groups, like Irish and Germans at the time, could own land and resist the oppression they've endured in many places, such as New York. And at its peak, Seneca Village, which we're seeing overlaid on this map on the right-hand side, this section of Central Park, had around 350 residents and a small farm town to support that community as well. But in the mid-19th century, sociologists and other thought leaders start to talk about new and greener ways to talk about urban landscapes, these large sections of cities that had feelings to them. And for them, like I said, it felt gritty. They emerged from industrialization and overpopulation, And these ideas of garden cities and the importance of public parks became central to the conversation to improve poor urban health. And so design public spaces became idealized as a social freedom that provided a field of interaction between people, different kinds of people, and different classes as well. And so as New York embraced these ideals for a major green space, the Common Council looked for locations that proposed the Central Park, and they chose to expand to Seneca Village. And so as this campaign continued, Central Park moved forward, and advocates and media outlets started to sensationalize Seneca Village as a shanty town, or the residents as squatters and vagabonds and scoundrels. And this language was used to talk about this place as the bottom, or an undesirable feeling of an urban landscape. Um, and so for 2 years, Seneca Village residents resisted the police, and they petitioned to try and get their homes saved, their churches and their schools, but this was largely unsuccessful, as Black Americans were not recognized citizens at that time under the law. And so by 1857, the New York City government leveraged eminent domain to evict all the village residents and usurp all of its private property. And so all of Seneca Village was razed within the year, and design and construction of Central Park started. This park, if you're familiar, was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Foe, a pair of designers that went on to build a lot of other large-scale public spaces around the United States. You might be familiar, for example, with the Olmsted Plan of LA, which tried to introduce large thoroughfares of green space into the county, was not realized evidently by the vibe of LA or Los Angeles if you've been there. And so the realized design, however, did have some benefits. It offered diversity in topography and transitions between bucolic and naturalistic landscape. And so where Seneca Village was, however, there was now a 106-acre reservoir, the Great Lawn, and other smaller playgrounds. However, in recognizing the community that used to live there, all that's left is this sign. And the naming of this sign, I think, is very interesting, is that it's searching for Seneca Village. And the fact that we're searching for it means we've kind of lost it. We've lost its existence, its engendered history of the space. And so this is not an uncommon narrative. You know, this could be compared to the process of gentrification we've talked about, where original residents are pushed out in favor of those with some social capital, whether it is money or it is their social standing or their race. And so in the context of recent events, there's been these examinations of how have spaces, how have our professions been anti-Black, or how can it support the movement for Black lives? And so while maybe the people organizing the example I'm about to talk to are not designers in the way we understand them, they are designing experiences and creating experiences within urban settings and landscapes. And so one example of this, as we've been seeing in many protests, is, you know, we've been hearing chants such as "Whose streets, our streets," "Fire, fire, gentrifier," echoing in cities across the country. And here in this image, I want to talk about an example from Louisville. And so what happened was about 100 protesters, some wearing Black Lives Matter shirts, a lot of them based around a lot of the stances of the movement for Black lives, started chanting and yelling at Mayor Fisher, the mayor of this town in Kentucky, as he started to speak at the opening of a low-income apartment complex called the Montgomery. And so these protesters occupied the spaces of the press conference and did not allow the mayor to finish the presentation. And the reason why these protesters had come to the press conference is that they had felt that the community living in the area at the time had not been included in the design process as part of a larger master plan for the neighborhood. So this development was one component of a larger master plan. And so here are people, as a way to intervene in the feeling of the public space or the urban landscape, are here protesting. And protesting is something we have been seeing often throughout, you know, even in slow across many countries in the United States, or across many cities in the United States and countries across the world. We've seen it here within our town of San Luis Obispo. Here is an image from the Race Matters rally on June 28th. Credit to Brucey on Tap, the Instagram account, who's been monumental in photographing a lot of the events here in San Luis Obispo. A note about sharing images of protest. I encourage all of you to not choose images of one or two people, as that could endanger individuals protesting. And so we encourage, as you share out what you're doing in your activities of public protest, sticking to larger group shots. But this image, an example of protesters taking up the intersection of Monterey, and I think there were around 3,000 people recorded to be in attendance at this protest. But here we're seeing in San Luis Obispo the transformation of the community of taking this street and turning it into a way to express, you know, being upset at the current state of police brutality, addressing racially motivated crimes against communities, and attaching it to the abolitionist movement. And so these community members decided to come together and have been continuing to come together, if you've been in San Luis Obispo and you've noticed, to express their opinions in the form of public protest. And we've seen this in larger cities, of course, such as in DC, with the painting of the Black Lives Matter mural along a large boulevard. But what must be considered as we start to see cities unite to broadcast these messages of support and to use public space and urban settings as a way to do this, we have to be critical of what this is doing, right? Because painting Black Lives Matters on the street doesn't address the reasons for why we're seeing racially motivated crimes against BIPOC or low-income communities. It's not addressing the prison or the school to prison pipeline or issues of lack of quality housing or of issues of food deserts. And so while it was great that Mayor Bowser approved the painting of this Black Lives Matter mural, Mayor Bowser did not change any of her governances of the city of Washington, D.C., or the area of Washington, D.C. And so while we use public spaces to continue to share our feelings about the movements going on, and especially in the context of Black Lives Matter, we must be critical of what this movement is doing. Because while we are painting the streets here and broadcasting a message, if there's retaliation, that retaliation is on Black, Indigenous, person of color communities or of low-income communities. It's not on the people who might be white or cis or of some social privilege. And that's not the point, right? That if we as allies want to align ourselves with the movement, we must be doing concrete change or systemic change as opposed to simply painting these spaces. And I'm sure all of you in your time in this last year or last 6 months have been seeing how your local communities, whether here in San Luis Obispo or in other areas, are starting to unite around addressing histories of oppression in public spaces and in urban landscapes. And so while this was meant to be, as every other learning series, an introductory example to a topic and just to start a discussion, we're gonna head over into our breakout rooms. And again, I'll introduce the question in a second, but I'd like to challenge you all to be uncomfortable and be in the space to ask questions. We're all here to communicate and learn and understand. We're here to support each other. And we encourage you to turn on your camera and unmute yourself if that's possible in your setting. If not, you're more than welcome to use the chat setting as well in our discussion. But just based on the few examples I've given today, and really I encourage you to pull from your experience in urban spaces or public spaces, answering the question of what spaces need to diversify the narratives they tell, and how do you think this could be done?